The tribunal chamber hummed with an eerie sterility, the kind of silence that gripped the chest like a vice. High, angular walls stretched toward an unseen ceiling, their smooth, polished surfaces reflecting the faint light of cold, artificial lamps. On the far side, an elevated dais held the council, a grotesque assembly of beings who, in their arrogance, had long since abandoned the need for empathy. They were beyond human, beyond the grasp of simple emotions like fear or remorse. To them, power was a cold, immutable fact, and this boy, this human child, was just another fleeting inconvenience. The boy stood at the center of the room, trembling slightly. He was young, no older than 13, and though his heart raced and his knees threatened to buckle beneath him, he stood tall. His eyes, wide and filled with a mix of fear and defiance, scanned the council, hoping for some flicker of compassion, some acknowledgement of his humanity. But there was none. One of the council members, a long-necked, reptilian creature with slick, greenish scales, leaned forward, its narrow eyes narrowing into slits. It tilted its head, studying the boy with an expression that could have been mistaken for curiosity if not for the cold glint in its eye. "You challenge the authority of the Empire, boy," it said, its voice hissing like steam escaping from a pressure valve. "Do you understand the weight of your crime?" The boy swallowed, his throat dry. I only questioned the taxes. My family. "The Empire does not tolerate dissent, least of all from your kind," the creature interrupted, its tongue flicking out from between its sharp teeth, tasting the air. "And your family is inconsequential." A few council members exchanged glances, the slightest flicker of amusement crossing their cold, emotionless faces. No one spoke. Silence hung thick in the air, as heavy as the weight of the boy's fate. He had no chance. He knew it now, but there was still that spark of resistance in him, that defiant piece of humanity that refused to be extinguished. "Please," the boy whispered, his voice cracking. "I just wanted to survive." But before he could finish, the execution pike, an elegant, deadly device, flickered to life with a sharp hum. It hovered, suspended above the boy's head, waiting. The boy's eyes widened, a look of sheer terror crossing his face, but he didn't scream. He had no chance to scream. The council had no patience for such things. One flicker of energy, and the pike discharged. There was no time for him to process the thought that crossed his mind, no time for fear to take hold completely. One instant, he was standing, his heart pounding in his chest, and the next, he was gone. The air around him shimmered as his body disintegrated in a burst of energy. Flesh dissolved into ash, bones cracked into dust, and within the span of a breath, the boy was no more than a cloud of particles, slowly being sucked into the chamber's air recyclers. No grand final words, no plea for mercy. Just silence, broken only by the faint hum of the pike's energy dissipating into the cold, empty air. The council barely blinked. A few of them tilted their elongated heads, their eyes glimmering like cold jewels, assessing the result with no more interest than one would show toward a bug swatted out of existence. To them, the boy's life had meant nothing. The slightest flick of the wrist, the merest thought of the council, and he was nothing, just a speck erased. A long, droning hiss echoed through the chamber, a council member's lips curling as it spoke. Such bravery! Such foolishness! How quaint! Laughter rippled through the room, a series of shrill, detached sounds, as if mocking the very idea of human dignity. The boy's life had been worth less than the flick of a hand, less than a second of their time. But the council's laughter had an edge, an underlying unease that none of them acknowledged. For none of them had realized yet that they had just crossed a line they would never be able to undo. There was no fanfare, no dramatic gesture. No words to mark the boy's passing. Just the fading echo of the council's laughter as they returned to their deliberations, their eyes glinting with cold amusement. Far outside the chamber, beyond the walls of polished stone, something had shifted. The air was still, too still, and the rows of lesser species, those who served the Empire, stopped moving. They had not been told to stop, but they did, instinctively, as if sensing a change they couldn't name. Some bowed their heads, as though shrinking into themselves, hoping that the shadows might swallow them whole. Others stared ahead, their eyes wide and full of dread, as if they too understood the significance of what had just occurred. For it wasn't just any child who had been killed. It was a human child. A whisper ran through the underworld of the Empire, unspoken but felt. There was no way to track it. No way to measure the ripple of it, but every living being felt it, deep in their bones. A wrong had been done. A terrible wrong. The Empire had made its choice, and it would have to live with it. Or, perhaps, it would die with it. But the Council, sitting on their high thrones, couldn't see it. They didn't understand the danger in what they had done. They couldn't. How could they? To them, humans were nothing more than fleeting, fragile creatures, pawns in a grand game. And yet, in the depths of the universe, one woman felt it. The Mother. A woman who had already started to move. Already set in motion the wheels that would turn, inexorably, toward the Empire. She would come for them. And nothing, not the Empire's arrogance, nor its vast power, would stop her. For she was no ordinary mother. She was Baba Yaga. On a small, quiet world, far removed from the glitz and arrogance of the Galactic Empire, Baba Yaga's hands moved with the grace of years. She was an older woman now, the lines on her face deepening with time, but her movements were fluid, deliberate, practiced. The knife she held gleamed briefly in the flickering firelight, slicing through bread with a rhythmic precision. Each movement was an act of familiarity, one that had been repeated 1,000 times before. In the corner, the dog lay at her feet, its head resting on the cold stone floor, eyes half closed in a quiet, patient watchfulness. The honey badger, a restless creature of defiance, roamed the room, occasionally stopping to gnaw at a bone or stretch out in the corner. They were her companions, loyal in ways that went beyond simple instinct. Their bond was unspoken, but understood. And in the stillness of the home, there was a peace that only came after years of solitude, years of grief, and years of preparation. Baba Yaga was alone. Her thoughts were never far from the world that she had left behind, a world full of memories, both joyful and painful. Her son, once a boy full of life and laughter, had grown into a young man, defiant and full of questions. He had been the one to challenge the Empire. He had dared to speak when the Empire said silence. He had dared to ask why. And now, he was gone. No more laughter, no more questions. Just ashes. But Baba Yaga was not a woman to dwell long in sorrow. There was no time for that now. She set the knife down, its blade tapping softly against the cutting board. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply felt the absence, the hollow place where her son had once been. His death had not broken her. It had awakened something else, something far darker. Then, it came. Not in the form of a loud noise or a voice calling out, but as a vibration deep within her chest. It was a silent message, one that bypassed all the traditional means of communication. The universe itself seemed to whisper directly into her bones, and she knew instantly what it meant. Your son is gone. Her hand paused, just for a moment, before continuing its motion, placing the knife down on the counter with deliberate care. The dog lifted its head, ears twitching, sensing the change in the air. The honey badger, ever the restless one, stopped gnawing on its bone and looked up, its sharp eyes meeting hers. Both animals knew something had shifted, but neither one made a sound. They understood the weight of the moment, as silent and inevitable as the growing storm. Baba Yaga closed her eyes, just for a heartbeat, allowing the grief to settle over her. A mother's grief could be a powerful thing, but it could also be a catalyst. And she would need that power now. She had not wanted this. She had hoped that her son's defiance would go unnoticed, that he would fade into the background, a fleeting moment in the vast machinery of the Empire. But the Empire had made its choice. And now, she would make hers. She straightened her back, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, she felt the weight of her purpose settle over her like armor. The world outside her home had just shifted, unbeknownst to the Empire, but it had shifted nonetheless. Her son's death would not be the end of this. It would be the beginning. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting long shadows across the stone walls. Baba Yaga turned her gaze toward the window, her eyes narrowing slightly as she stared out at the dusk settling over the land. The quiet was broken only by the soft sound of the wind and the distant howl of a lone creature calling out in the night. She would go to them. She would go to the Empire. But she would not go alone. Her hand reached for the satchel, a simple bag of worn leather. She didn't need much. There were no weapons, no grand displays of power. Everything she needed was already within her. The dog, loyal and quiet, followed her without question as she moved toward the door. The honey badger, ever the unpredictable one, bounded ahead, its claws clicking against the floor like a drumbeat, ready for the chaos that was about to unfold. Baba Yaga stepped outside, her cloak brushing against the stone. The night air hit her face, crisp and cold, carrying with it the faintest scent of herbs from the garden and the promise of something far more dangerous than the Empire could ever have anticipated. She moved without hurry, without fanfare. There was no need for either. She had been waiting for this moment her entire life. The stars above her flickered, distant and indifferent, as she walked toward the port. The path was familiar, but it felt different tonight. Every step she took was a step toward a reckoning, toward the empire that had taken so much from her and never thought to look back. At the port, the ship was already waiting. No words were spoken as she boarded. The pilots, their heads bowed in silent reverence, did not need to ask where she was headed. They knew. And so, without hesitation, the ship powered up, its engines humming softly in the night. Baba Yaga did not need to give a destination. The ship knew, or perhaps the universe did. The journey had already begun. She sat still as the ship launched into the sky, the dog lying at her feet, the honey badger curled on her lap. There was no need for conversation. No need for any words at all. The only thing that mattered now was the destination ahead, and the reckoning that would follow. Her hands were steady. Her eyes closed, but her mind was sharp, every detail of the path ahead already laid out in her thoughts. The Empire would not expect her. They would laugh at the idea of one woman, armed with nothing but her animals and her grief, bringing them to their knees. They would underestimate her, just as they had underestimated her son. And when they realized their mistake, it would be far too late. The ship entered hyperspace with a smooth hum, the stars outside stretching into bright lines, marking the passage of time. In the silence of the ship, Baba Yaga let out a long, slow breath. It was not a breath of peace, but of inevitability. The time for waiting was over. She would make them pay. And the Empire? The Empire would learn what it meant to challenge a mother's love, and the wrath that followed. The heart of the Galactic Empire beat with a steady, mechanical rhythm. Its capital, a sprawling citadel that stretched toward the stars, was a monument to its untouchable might. Towering spires reached high into the sky, their smooth surfaces gleaming in the cold light of artificial suns. Beneath this gleaming facade, the true power of the Empire lay in the Council, a group of untouchable beings whose word was law across 1,000 worlds. They ruled not with compassion, but with control, and they saw themselves as the inevitable force in the universe. The council chambers, located deep within the heart of the capital, were designed to reflect that power. The room was vast, its walls made of a dark, metallic material that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. At the center, the council sat on a raised dais, a gathering of species whose bodies were alien in every sense. The room was always cool, clinical, a place for cold deliberation, not emotions. Today, the council had gathered to discuss the death of the human boy, who had dared to challenge their authority. His execution had been swift, his death a blip in the grand scheme of things. The council members, some of whom had lived for millennia, were unmoved by the loss of such a fleeting life. The boy had meant nothing to them. He had simply been another fool who believed that his voice could matter. Now, the Empire was one fool lighter. "What do we make of the boy's death?" asked the counselor with the elongated neck, his voice cool and detached. "He was a nuisance," replied another, a creature with gleaming silver scales and sharp eyes. "One less thorn in the side of the Empire. His kind can't understand that rebellion is useless. It's a waste of breath." A third voice, a soft-spoken being whose features were hidden beneath a veil of shifting light, chimed in. "He wasn't even old enough to know what he was doing." How typical. And yet, it seems the humans are the ones who continue to test our patience. They never learn. Laughter rippled through the room, high-pitched and cruel. It was the laughter of those who had seen and done everything and found it all beneath them. The council found no need to hold a formal meeting for such an insignificant matter. The boy's death was only the latest example of humanity's misplaced arrogance, their belief that they could ever challenge the Empire's supremacy. Yet, as they laughed, a subtle shift rippled through the air. It was a whisper, so faint that no one could hear it. The hum of the room, the metallic drone of the air recyclers, continued uninterrupted, but something had changed. One of the younger council members, a reptilian creature with skin the color of autumn leaves, shifted in his seat, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "I've heard whispers among the lower ranks," he said, his voice cautious. "A rumor, of sorts, about the boy's mother. They say she's different." Another council member, an ancient being whose voice sounded like the rustling of dry leaves, chuckled softly. "What, you mean one of their so-called myths? Another tale of some impossible human hero who rises from the ashes? Nothing more than a ghost story." The young counselor hesitated, but pressed on. "They're calling her Baba Yaga. It's said she's not just another grieving mother. She has a reputation, a history among the humans, one that even we should be wary of. If she is who they say she is." The laughter in the chamber faltered, as if the very air had thickened. The older members of the council exchanged uneasy glances, a flicker of doubt passing between them. It was only a moment, but it was enough. "Enough," the silver-scaled counselor snapped, his eyes flashing. "This is nonsense. No human, no matter how legend or myth, could pose a threat to us. We control the stars. We control everything." He stood up, his voice growing louder with each word, his authority absolute. "We are the Empire. There is no force that can stand against us. This woman, whoever she may be, is nothing more than a distraction. She will find no ally in the stars. Now, we move forward. The boy is dead. Humanity will mourn and forget. And we will continue as we always have." A silence lingered in the air. It was the silence that followed certainty, the kind that spoke of an unshakable belief in the inevitable. Yet, beneath that silence, the young counselor remained tense. There was something unsettling in the quiet after the laughter, a subtle crack in the Empire's veneer. Outside the chamber, the sound of the Empire was far different than the serene, controlled hum of the council's halls. The streets of the capital city buzzed with an energy that pulsed, frantic and unaware. Citizens walked hurriedly, their faces hidden behind masks of indifference, lost in the great machine of the Empire that ground on relentlessly. The lower species that served the Empire moved like shadows, their every step a desperate attempt to avoid drawing attention. In the shadows, whispers spread. They started quietly at first, in hushed tones among the workers, but as the news of the boy's death reached farther, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. And through it all, the same name slipped from the tongues of those who dared to speak of it. Baba Yaga. The name was carried on the wind, passed from ear to ear, but it was not spoken lightly. To the citizens of the Empire, it was a legend, a ghost, a myth, and yet, there was something about it that made even the most hardened hearts hesitate. The name carried with it an air of inevitability, the kind that came only when the wrong had been done. Back in the council chamber, the Empire's leaders had dismissed the warning. They believed they were invincible, untouchable by the forces they so readily dismissed. But as they continued to discuss irrelevant matters, the subtle unease grew. It simmered in the background, ignored but never quite gone. Their arrogance remained, but now, it was paired with something else, doubt. A soft chime echoed through the chamber, signaling the arrival of a new transmission. The council members glanced up, but no one moved. It was a trivial update, no doubt, a routine report on the progress of the Empire's expanding fleet or trade routes. A dark figure, draped in shadow, stood just inside the door, his voice low and clipped. "You've made a mistake. The mother is coming." The room fell silent. The words hung in the air, as if they were not just words, but a declaration of something far more sinister. The council looked to one another, their faces betraying nothing, but in their eyes, a flicker of fear had begun to take root. The Empire's arrogance, once unshakable, was beginning to crack. The storm was coming. They had no way of knowing it yet, but the first whispers of it had already reached them. And they were too late to stop it. The ship glided through the vast emptiness of space, its engines humming with quiet power, an unspoken promise of what was to come. Inside, Baba Yaga sat with an unnerving calm, her hands folded in her lap as she stared out into the darkness. The stars were distant pinpricks of light, indifferent to the chaos that was about to unfold. The journey felt long, but in truth, it had just begun. She had left behind the world she knew, the quiet moments, the rhythms of her days, and now the hum of the ship beneath her was the only sound that filled the space. Her mind was clear, focused. There would be no mistakes. There could be no hesitation. The dog lay at her feet, eyes half closed, sensing her stillness. The honey badger paced restlessly beside her, its small, sharp eyes glinting in the dim light. Despite its feisty nature, there was an unusual tension about it. Even it, unpredictable as it was, knew that this journey was different. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about sending a message. The journey felt slow, though the ship was already pushing toward the heart of the Empire. Baba Yaga didn't need to rush. The time for speed had passed. She had only one destination now, and it wasn't the Empire's capital alone. It was the heart of their arrogance. On the other side of the universe, the Empire's council remained blissfully unaware of the storm approaching. As they continued their deliberations, the atmosphere in the chamber had shifted ever so slightly. The conversation had moved away from the boy's death, an event that had already begun to fade in the minds of the most powerful beings in the Empire, and turned to other matters. Trade routes. Military strategy. Nothing of importance, nothing to stir the mind of an empire that had long seen itself as unchallenged. The long-necked counselor, the one who had dismissed the concerns about the boy's mother, leaned back in his seat, a sneer playing at the edge of his lips. Let her come. One grieving human woman cannot possibly be a threat to us. One of the more arrogant members, a hulking creature with pale blue skin, joined in. We've extinguished their defiance before. This is no different. She will mourn, perhaps speak some empty words, but in the end, she will fade like all the others. The silver-scaled counselor, whose sharp eyes had once carried only confidence, glanced over at his companions, a flicker of doubt still clinging to the edges of his mind. Perhaps, but we are not blind to the stirrings of rebellion. This woman, whoever she may be, could become a symbol for those who refuse to bow to our will. Another counselor, one whose face was hidden beneath translucent membranes, laughed softly. Let her. Let them all rise. The Empire is eternal. We have crushed every uprising. We have silenced every voice. This is nothing more than a distraction. They had no idea. Baba Yaga's ship entered the outskirts of the Empire's capital system, and as it did, the distant stars blurred into a bright mist, the darkness of space beginning to turn into something solid, something suffocating. She looked out the window one last time. There was no turning back now. The ship moved toward the planet's surface, descending through layers of atmosphere and shielded defenses. Despite the Empire's technological might, the ship slipped through their radar with eerie ease, undetected, unnoticed. Not because it was faster or more powerful, but because it was invisible in ways they could not understand. In the heart of the capital, alarms began to go off, but too late. There was no time to prepare. Baba Yaga had already arrived. The Empire's capital was a sprawling city of glass and steel, a testament to their strength and grandeur. The Council's fortress, a monolithic structure towering above the city, reflected the Empire's pride, cold, untouchable, and full of themselves. Inside the council chamber, the atmosphere had turned tense. The younger members still whispered about Baba Yaga, though most of their fears were buried beneath layers of arrogance. But even the most hardened among them couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The hum of the chamber grew louder, a foreboding sound that made the walls seem to press in on them. And then, as if to confirm their worst fears, the doors to the chamber opened. She walked in, alone. The guards at the entrance did not stop her. Their weapons, poised and ready, remained at their sides. They did not see her as a threat. They were wrong. The council turned their attention toward her, their faces unreadable. She stood before them, calm, unmoving. The silence in the room grew heavier as the seconds passed, stretching into eternity. No one spoke. No one moved. The first to break the silence was the long-necked counselor, his voice dripping with disdain. "Ah, so the human woman arrives. How quaint. Did you come to mourn the boy's death? Perhaps you'd like to thank us for doing what you failed to." Baba Yaga's eyes flicked briefly to him. Her gaze was sharp, like a blade drawn from the dark, but she didn't speak. Her mouth remained set, her silence far more powerful than any words could have been. "Speak, woman," a new voice boomed. It was the deep voice of the silver-scaled counselor. "What is it you want? Revenge? To ask for mercy?" His laughter echoed, though it felt hollow now. "You will not find it here." Baba Yaga smiled then, a slow, unsettling smile. It wasn't warm or comforting. It was the kind of smile a grandmother might give a child before administering discipline. It was calm, controlled, and utterly terrifying. "No," she said, her voice soft but carrying enough weight to quiet the room. "I didn't come to ask for mercy. I came to thank you." The council blinked, their confusion momentarily palpable. "Thank us," the blue-skinned counselor repeated, a sneer tugging at his lips. "For what?" "For clarity," Baba Yaga replied, her tone almost conversational. "You gave me clarity. I had almost forgotten what it feels like to lose. But now, I remember." She tilted her head slightly, her eyes glinting with something sharp, something far more dangerous than they could comprehend. "You killed my son," she continued, her voice still low, but now carrying the weight of all the grief and fury she had held in check for years. "And for that, I will repay you." A murmur spread across the room, and the air seemed to grow thicker, heavier. There was something about her presence, something so unshakable that the council could feel the shift, but they still didn't understand. The long-necked counselor snorted. "This is absurd. Do you truly think we'll tremble before you? You are nothing but one human woman. Do you think you can stand against the Empire?" She smiled again, this time wider. "I don't expect you to tremble," she said, her words laced with something dark. "I expect you to laugh." Her smile never faltered. The room, which had once seemed so vast and imposing, now felt small. The once invincible empire was suddenly dwarfed by the weight of her gaze. The council, still unaware of the storm they had unleashed, sat frozen, as if they could not escape the inevitable. Her silence grew louder. The dog at her feet shifted slightly, its gaze sharp, focused. The honey badger, ever unpredictable, flicked its tail restlessly, as if preparing for the chaos to come. Baba Yaga did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The power in her words, in her presence, was enough to shatter the Empire's arrogance. "You thought you killed a boy," she said softly. "But what you killed was a mask. And now, you will see what lies beneath." The chamber grew even quieter. The council members, once so confident, now shifted uncomfortably. They had made a fatal mistake. And they were about to find out just how deadly it was. The silence in the council chamber was no longer comfortable. It was thick, suffocating, and filled with the quiet hum of the Empire's arrogance cracking. Baba Yaga stood before them, calm and unyielding, her eyes scanning the room like a predator sizing up its prey. The council, so used to commanding respect and power, now found themselves under the weight of her quiet presence. The long-necked counselor, the one who had first mocked her, was the first to break the stillness. His voice, once dripping with scorn, now held an edge of uncertainty. "This is ridiculous," he sneered, though his words faltered as he spoke them. "You come here, one woman, and think you can command us? What, do you believe your grief gives you power?" Baba Yaga didn't move, didn't flinch. She simply regarded him, her gaze steady and sharp. Her mouth curled into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You still don't understand," she said quietly, almost with pity. You think this is about grief. You think this is about a mother mourning her son. But it's not. It never was. Her voice, though soft, had a coldness that made the room feel colder. The air seemed to thin, the atmosphere thickening with the weight of her words. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The council members exchanged uncertain glances, but their pride held them fast. None would be the first to show weakness. The silver-scaled counselor, who had been more vocal in dismissing her earlier, leaned forward, his hands slamming against the polished surface of the dais. You are a fool, he growled, his patience wearing thin. We are the rulers of the galaxy. You are nothing but a fading memory, a relic of a dying species. You think you can stand against us? You think we fear you? Baba Yaga's smile never wavered, but her eyes turned colder. The dog at her feet shifted slightly, its ears pricked, its gaze fixed and unblinking on the council. The honey badger, still restless, let out a low, threatening growl that seemed to echo through the chamber. It was a small sound, but it carried an unmistakable warning. You don't fear me, Baba Yaga said, her voice steady. But you will. You fear what I represent. You fear what's been buried inside humanity for centuries. You think you've crushed it, but you've only made it stronger. The council was silent now, their arrogance faltering under the weight of her words. They had underestimated her, dismissed her as another powerless human. But she was not just any human. She was something more, something they had failed to recognize. The long-necked counselor tried again, his voice now tinged with a trace of unease. We've crushed uprisings before. We've seen your kind break before, bend to the will of the Empire. Why would this be any different? Baba Yaga's smile widened slightly, but it was not one of amusement. It was something far darker. This is different, she said, each word precise and measured. Because you killed my son. And for that, there will be consequences. You may have broken many, but you have never faced the consequence of killing something that cannot be destroyed. The room shifted again. The council, usually so composed and powerful, seemed to shrink under the weight of her calm certainty. The silver-scaled counselor's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing with disbelief. You threaten the Empire? With what? Words? How quaint. Baba Yaga shook her head. No, not words. Action. At that moment, the hum of the chamber seemed to grow louder, a subtle vibration that ran through the floor and into the walls. It was almost imperceptible, but for the first time, the council members looked at each other with real fear in their eyes. The young counselor, the one who had first warned them about Baba Yaga, swallowed hard. He knew. He had heard the stories. He had heard the whispers from the lower ranks. He had heard of the woman who had never lost, who had never been defeated, whose name alone struck fear into the hearts of those who dared cross her. And now, as the tension in the room mounted, he understood, this was no ordinary woman. She was a force. And they had provoked it. Outside the chamber, the city of the Empire buzzed on, unaware of the storm gathering in the heart of their power. The streets were filled with the usual hum of traffic, the chatter of citizens, the soft hum of life continuing on in the sprawling metropolis. But something had changed. There was a ripple of unease, a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The lower species, the workers and servants, sensed it first. A whisper began to travel, quiet at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. Baba Yaga is here. The name was spoken in hushed tones, exchanged between the workers, the slaves, the ones who had been beaten down for so long that they had forgotten what hope felt like. But now, as the name passed through the streets, it ignited something in them, a spark of defiance, a glimmer of something they hadn't felt in years. And in the distance, high above, at the heart of the Empire's great fortress, the council continued to dismiss the warnings, to laugh at the woman who had come to challenge them. Back in the council chamber, the unease was palpable now. The long-necked counselor, usually the most composed of them all, found his confidence slipping. The silver-scaled counselor sat back in his chair, his hands now clenched tightly at his sides, his once unshakable demeanor faltering. Baba Yaga's eyes never left them. Her silence was her weapon now. She let the tension in the room build, and she let them feel it, because she knew what was coming. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to shout. All she needed was time. And they had given her that. Her gaze flicked briefly to the high windows that overlooked the capital, to the ships in orbit, to the defenses that once seemed impenetrable. None of it mattered. They were already lost. She tilted her head slightly, breaking the silence at last. "You're all so confident," she said, her tone lighter now. "You speak of destroying rebellions, of crushing defiance. But there's one thing you don't understand." The council waited, though no one spoke. She smiled again, though this time, it wasn't an expression of amusement. It was something far more final. "You think you can control everything. You think you can erase us. But humanity is not something you can wipe out. It's not something you can destroy. You have never faced a reckoning like this. And now, you will." The tension in the room reached its peak. The council members were frozen, their minds racing, their once unshakable certainty now in pieces around them. But it was too late for second thoughts. Baba Yaga had already begun. And the Empire? It would never be the same again. The chamber, once a bastion of authority and control, had become a pressure cooker, the air thick with tension. The council was no longer certain of themselves. The bravado they had once worn like a badge now felt like a mask they could no longer hold in place. Baba Yaga had delivered her quiet ultimatum, and the walls that had seemed so imposing only an hour ago now felt thin, brittle, and hollow. The silver-scaled counselor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers tapping nervously against the smooth surface of the dais. The long-necked counselor, usually a pillar of unshakable confidence, refused to meet Baba Yaga's gaze. Instead, he stared down at the polished floor, his posture rigid with suppressed anxiety. There were cracks in the Empire's facade, and they were growing wider with every second. One by one, the council members began to murmur among themselves, their voices low, almost hesitant. It was a shift that couldn't be ignored. Baba Yaga stood unmoving, her eyes scanning them with unnerving precision. The silence between them was not the silence of contemplation or respect. It was the silence of a predator watching its prey hesitate, knowing that it was too late to escape. Her voice, when it broke the silence, was calm and deliberate. "You still don't understand," she said, her words echoing in the chamber. "You think your technology, your vast armies, your walls of stone and metal will protect you from what's coming. But you're wrong. Your might means nothing if you don't understand what true power is." The council shifted uneasily, but no one dared to respond. The weight of her words was enough to make even the most powerful beings in the room falter. They had seen wars, rebellions, uprisings, nothing had ever truly threatened them. Until now. "We've conquered countless worlds," the blue-skinned counselor finally spoke, his voice trembling just slightly. "What makes you think you are any different from the others? Another fleeting human, come to complain about your petty grievances. You will leave here as quickly as you came. Do not mistake your grief for power." Baba Yaga's lips parted in a slow, dangerous smile. "You still believe that, don't you?" she asked softly, her tone cutting through the air like a blade. "That your power comes from technology? From strength? You believe that the will of the Empire is unassailable? But it's not. Your power comes from fear. And fear is a fragile thing." The words hung in the air, thick and biting. The Empire's greatest weapon was its control over fear, but fear was something fragile, something that could be shattered in an instant. Baba Yaga knew that better than anyone. It was the thread that had been severed when her son died, and now it was the thread she would use to unravel the entire empire. The chamber's temperature seemed to drop, the weight of her statement settling on everyone like a suffocating fog. The long-necked counselor finally broke, his voice shaking as he spoke. "What do you want from us? Why are you here?" "I'm here for what was taken from me," Baba Yaga replied, her eyes narrowing as she stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "I'm here because you killed my son. And for that, I will make you understand what true fear is. Not the kind you wield with your weapons or your ships. The kind you'll feel when you realize you've underestimated the one thing you never thought you would. Her voice softened, but the venom in it was unmistakable. The one thing you'll never understand until it's too late. The power of a mother who has nothing left to lose. The room went quiet again, but this time, the silence felt different. The council's arrogance was gone, replaced by the dawning realization that they had miscalculated. The fear they had worked so hard to instill in others had turned inward. It was no longer just about the boy's death, it was about the consequences of underestimating her. The silver-scaled counselor was the first to react, his voice rising in a desperate attempt to reassert control. Enough! You will not speak to us this way. You are nothing. Baba Yaga raised her hand, and at the simple gesture, the chamber seemed to hold its breath. The council fell silent. You don't get it, she whispered. You never did. You thought I came to plead, to beg for mercy. You thought you could break me. But you can't break something that has already been shattered. You've woken something inside me, something you will never understand until it's far too late. Her eyes swept over the council one last time, each one of them staring back with a mix of fear and disbelief. They were realizing, at last, what she had known all along: this was no ordinary woman standing before them. She was a force. And they had unleashed it by underestimating her. Baba Yaga turned, not waiting for their response. Her calm, deliberate steps echoed through the chamber, but there was no sense of finality. This was not the end, it was the beginning. The council remained seated, their faces pale, their thoughts scattered. The air in the chamber felt thick with the weight of her words. For the first time, they felt vulnerable, as though something fundamental had shifted within the fabric of their power. Outside, the hum of the empire continued as it always had. But things had changed. Baba Yaga had arrived, and her presence was already being felt in ways the council could not understand. In the streets, beneath the towering spires of the capital, whispers began to spread. Baba Yaga is here. The name moved through the city like wildfire, passing from mouth to mouth. And though the empire's walls were still intact, there was a growing sense of unease, a feeling that something was coming, something they had no control over. The storm had begun. And the empire was not prepared. Back in the council chamber, the silence stretched on, heavy and unbearable. The long-necked counselor finally broke it, his voice a ragged whisper. What now? The question hung in the air, unanswered. The council members were too afraid to speak, too afraid to acknowledge what they had failed to see. They had made a mistake. A fatal one. Baba Yaga had already made her move. And soon, the empire would feel the consequences. The chamber had become a tomb of uneasy silence. Despite the council's previous bravado, Baba Yaga's presence had unsettled them in ways none of their vast knowledge or power could explain. Her words had hung in the air like an omen, and now, the atmosphere was thick with something neither the empire's technology nor its military might could easily dispel: fear. Baba Yaga had turned her back on them, and with every step she took away from the dais, the distance between them grew. The unspoken weight of her calm assured them that they had already lost. Outside the council chamber, high above the capital, the city remained oblivious to the gathering storm. The empire's machines of war, its legions and fleets, continued to hum along their predetermined courses, unaware that their foundations were about to be shaken. Inside the chamber, the council had begun to murmur, their words drifting into the silence like echoes in a canyon. It wasn't the usual confident chatter of those in power. There was something brittle about their voices now, as if their certainty had started to crack under the strain of Baba Yaga's quiet fury. One council member, a rotund figure with spiny, translucent skin, leaned forward, his voice low but laced with unease. This woman, she has no army. No weapons. She cannot possibly threaten us. We control the galaxy. The silver-scaled counselor, the one who had dismissed her most vehemently, remained unmoved on the surface, but his hands clenched, his nails biting into the polished surface of the dais. You're wrong, he said, his voice sharp but laced with an edge of uncertainty. She's already won. The moment she stepped into this chamber, she claimed her victory. We've underestimated her. All of us. Another council member, a lithe, winged figure who had remained silent up until now, finally spoke. Her words, they're not just threats. It's as if she knows something we don't. She's not just a grieving mother. She's a storm. The young counselor, who had first warned of Baba Yaga's arrival, nodded grimly. She is a force. A force we cannot control. The silver-scaled counselor's mouth twisted into a bitter sneer. We still have the fleet. We still have the Empire's strength. We have never been challenged like this, but we will crush her. Just like we've crushed every rebellion, every defiance. She is no different. But even as he spoke, a doubt gnawed at the back of his mind. His words had once come easily, full of certainty. Now, the confidence was slipping, like sand through his fingers. Something wasn't right. And he couldn't shake the feeling that Baba Yaga had already won the war without even raising her voice. On the planet's surface, the calm continued, deceptively so. The Empire's power appeared unshaken, its capital still glittering under the artificial light of the city's towering spires. But the Empire's true strength was built on more than just buildings and technology. It was built on fear, and now that fear was beginning to unravel. Baba Yaga's ship was still hidden in plain sight, cloaked by the very systems the Empire thought they had mastered. It had passed unnoticed through the defenses, silent, unmarked, and undetected. No one had noticed it yet, but it had already begun its silent mission. And then, the first ripple in the Empire's perfect facade broke the surface. Up in orbit, above the capital, the Empire's massive fleet stood ready, a carefully orchestrated show of power. Ships glided through space like metal behemoths, their weapons primed and their shields secure. The commanders, with their cool-headed calculations, were confident that no force could penetrate their defenses. But the silent ship was already there. Baba Yaga's fleet had arrived. It wasn't the explosion of a sudden, overwhelming force that marked its arrival, but the eerie stillness that spread across the fleet like a shadow, creeping quietly through the network of satellites, sensors, and communication lines. At first, no one noticed. Then, systems began to flicker. Communications failed, and strange, corrupted signals began to ripple through the airwaves. Suddenly, the shields of the Empire's warships began to flicker, fluctuating without warning. Power grids turned unstable. The weapon systems, once so reliable, went dead. A low, creeping panic began to spread. Officers glanced nervously at each other, unsure of what was happening. No attack, no missile strike, no obvious assault, just the sudden, inexplicable failure of every system they had relied on. "It's the signal network," one of the commanders muttered, staring at his screen in disbelief. It's been corrupted. All communications, gone. We can't reach the surface. We're..." Before he could finish, an alarm blared. A ripple of energy swept across the fleet, a flash so bright it cut through the blackness of space. One of the capital ships, massive in size and once thought invulnerable, erupted in a burst of light, debris scattering in every direction as its shields failed completely. "We're being attacked," another officer shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "Shields down. Shields are down." The chaos was swift. The once impervious fleet, brimming with might, was suddenly a collection of sitting ducks. The officers scrambled, trying to regain control of their systems, but it was too late. In the distance, the shadowy form of Baba Yaga's fleet, silent and patient, began to materialize in full view. It was not an overwhelming force. It didn't need to be. The Empire's defenses had already been compromised. And that was the key. She had waited. She had watched. And now, as the Empire floundered, she moved. Back on the surface, in the council chamber, the stillness had grown. No one dared to speak. Every eye was fixed on the long-necked counselor, who finally stood, his face ashen. They're dead," he muttered. "We've lost our fleet. We've lost our communications." There was no dramatic cry of alarm, no shout of orders to rally. The council members simply stared, paralyzed by the enormity of their failure. "We were wrong," the silver-scaled counselor said quietly, his voice shaking. She didn't come to fight us. She didn't need to. She came to dismantle us from the inside out. A cold, deep silence settled over the room. The fleet had fallen, and the capital trembled under the weight of its impending doom. The silent, patient destruction of the empire had begun, and no one had even seen it coming. Baba Yaga had moved with such precision, with such deliberation, that the empire's own arrogance had led to its downfall. The power it had once relied on, the control it had over its systems and its fleets, was now nothing but a hollow shell. And Baba Yaga, the mother who had lost everything, had waited patiently. Now, as the empire's fortress shook beneath her feet, she stepped forward, her final move already in motion. The reckoning had come. The empire's arrogance was crumbling under the weight of a single, determined force. And Baba Yaga was just getting started. The lights in the council chamber flickered, the hum of power starting to strain against an unseen pressure. The walls seemed to grow thicker with each passing second, as if the very structure of the empire's stronghold was under siege, not from the outside, but from within. The sudden, incomprehensible failure of the fleet had left the council in stunned silence, but now, an even greater terror was creeping through the air, curling into the marrow of every councillor present. Baba Yaga's calm had never wavered. She stood before them, her eyes sharp, unreadable, as the power of her silence settled in the room like a thick fog. The dog lay at her feet, still as stone. The honey badger, always a creature of restless energy, seemed almost at peace in her presence, its sharp eyes scanning the room with the same quiet intensity. The council members were no longer the mighty beings they once thought themselves to be. They were no longer impervious to fate. The one thing they had underestimated, the quiet, unyielding strength of a mother scorned, had already begun to consume them. A low hum echoed through the chamber, like the sound of distant thunder, but it wasn't the storm they had imagined. It was the sound of their own undoing. And in the back of their minds, each counselor understood, this wasn't the rebellion they were used to facing. This wasn't some fleeting uprising. This was a reckoning. Finally, the silver-scaled counselor, his arrogance now stripped away, broke the silence. His voice trembled, barely a whisper, You destroyed our fleet. You. No, Baba Yaga cut him off, her voice calm but carrying the weight of inevitability. You destroyed your own fleet. I merely took away the tools you used to deceive yourselves. The moment you underestimated me, you signed your death sentence. The silver-scaled counselor's mouth opened, but no words came out. His eyes darted to his colleagues, who looked as helpless as he did. The sense of power they once wielded was gone, replaced by a paralyzing fear that none of their strategies, their weapons, could defend against. Another counselor, a towering being with glassy, multifaceted eyes, stood up abruptly, his voice shaking. This can't be happening. We are the Empire. We are the future. The future? Baba Yaga's words sliced through his panic with deadly precision. What is the future to an empire that's forgotten how to see beyond its own arrogance? You killed my son because you believed your future was assured. Well, now, you will understand what it means to be mortal. She took a single step forward, and the room seemed to fold around her. The dog at her feet stood as well, its ears flat against its head, its posture alert. The honey badger, restless again, paced behind her, the sound of its claws scraping against the floor like a ticking clock. The council's grip on reality was slipping. The cracks in their facade deepened. The long-necked counselor finally spoke, his voice small, broken. You've already won. What do you want from us? What is it you expect? Baba Yaga's gaze was unwavering. What I want, she echoed, her smile thin and chilling. What I want is simple. Justice. You thought you could break me, destroy my world, my family. But the truth is, you destroyed yourselves. You handed me the only thing I needed, clarity. The council stood frozen, unable to respond. The weight of her words hung in the air, oppressive and inescapable. She continued, her voice as sharp as ever. You think you control everything because you have fleets and armies and weapons. But the true power is never in what you can destroy. It's in what you can create. The power of the human spirit, the one thing you thought you could crush, is the thing that will bring you to your knees. The silver-scaled counselor's lip curled in a snarl, but his words faltered. We will rebuild, he spat. We will destroy you and everything you stand for. Baba Yaga's response was a smile, but it wasn't one of reassurance. It was the kind of smile you give just before you end a conversation. You think I care about your rebuilding? She asked softly. The only thing left for you to rebuild is the dust you'll be reduced to. The tension in the room was unbearable now. The silence had shifted from one of anticipation to something darker. Something that smelled like inevitability. Far beyond the walls of the council chamber, the Empire's defenses had been compromised. What was once impenetrable was now crumbling, piece by piece. Ships continued to fall from the skies like shooting stars, their once glorious armor shredded and twisted under the precision of Baba Yaga's forces. The Empire's fleet, the pride of its technological might, was now nothing more than a collection of broken pieces scattered in the void. The attack had been swift, surgical, and unseen. Baba Yaga had not needed to fire a single shot. She had not needed to draw a weapon. The Empire had done the work for her, leaving themselves vulnerable in their own arrogance. Their systems, their communications, their power grids, everything had been compromised, as if a silent hand had reached inside their most secure places and turned them off. And now, one by one, their defenses fell apart. The council members looked at each other, their fear now visible. The thought of submission, of surrender, hovered between them, but none could bring themselves to say it aloud. Baba Yaga was not done with them. Not yet. The long-necked counselor turned toward the window, his hands trembling as he stared out into the vastness of the capital. The city, once so vibrant and full of life, was now eerily still, the lights flickering, the streets deserted. The Empire's pulse had slowed to a halt, and no one was coming to save them. We have no choice, he said, his voice hollow. We can't fight back. We can't survive. Baba Yaga nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering. You never had a choice, she said. You thought you could destroy everything that mattered to me. You thought you could make me forget. But now, I remember. And now, I collect. She turned to face them fully, her presence consuming the room. Your empire is nothing without the fear that holds it together. You broke it yourself when you killed my son. And now, you will pay the price. The silver-scaled counselor finally spoke, his voice shaking but defiant. What do you want from us, then? What do you expect us to do? Baba Yaga's smile returned, colder than ever. You have two options, she said, her voice quiet, but each word cutting through the silence like a blade. You can submit to humanity's will. You can kneel and acknowledge the truth, that we are not so easily erased. Or. Her smile deepened. Or you can face extinction. Quickly. Cleanly. Without fanfare. You will be forgotten, your name lost to the void. But either way, your time is up. The room was still, the quiet suffocating. You have one last choice, Baba Yaga whispered, her voice low, but filled with finality. Submit, or die. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The council had already chosen, but they were too afraid to say it aloud. Their pride had failed them, their power had failed them, and now, their arrogance had sealed their fate. Baba Yaga stepped toward the door, her voice the last thing they would hear. I will remember. And you will not. The choice is yours. With one final glance over her shoulder, she walked out of the chamber, her dog and honey badger trailing silently behind her. And as the doors closed, the empire of arrogance and power began to collapse, piece by piece, under the weight of its own miscalculation. The storm had come. And with it, everything the empire had built was now crumbling to dust. The once pristine council chamber now felt like a dying thing, its sterile, polished surfaces reflecting the fading light of an empire on the brink of collapse. The towering windows, which had once looked out over the sprawling capital city, an emblem of the empire's invincibility, now seemed like fragile glass, cracked and clouded. The hum of artificial power systems, once so confident, was now sporadic, flickering, as if the very foundation of the empire was beginning to fade. The council, once so proud, so invulnerable, was now nothing but a collection of broken beings, their bodies still seated at the dais, their faces twisted with a mixture of fear, denial, and disbelief. They had been powerful once, unassailable in their arrogance, but now that arrogance was their undoing. And standing before them was Baba Yaga, calm as ever, a single human woman who had brought them to their knees without raising a hand in violence, without even raising her voice. Her dog lay at her feet, still and composed, while the honey badger, always restless, paced behind her, an unpredictable reminder that the true force of the reckoning was not in the hands of weapons, but in the quiet fury of a mother wronged. The council members couldn't decide who would speak first, but it didn't matter. Baba Yaga had already claimed the room. She had claimed their future. The long-necked counselor, whose arrogance had once set the tone for all of their deliberations, looked up at her with wide, haunted eyes. "What do you want from us?" he asked, his voice trembling. "We've lost everything. The fleet is gone. The capital is collapsing. What more do you want from us?" Her gaze never wavered. She didn't flinch. There was no anger in her eyes, just quiet, implacable certainty. "What I want," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade, "is what should have been given to me the moment you killed my son." The council shifted, uncomfortable, uncertain. The weight of her words was like a storm cloud hanging low over their heads. "We don't have anything left to give," the silver-scaled counselor said, his voice weak, uncharacteristically strained. His earlier bravado had all but evaporated. "You've taken everything. We are powerless. What do you want us to do?" Baba Yaga took a slow, deliberate step forward, her eyes never leaving his. "You speak of powerlessness as if it's something I care about," she replied, her tone steady. "You think that I'm here to take something from you, but in truth, you have nothing left to give. What I want is your recognition. I want you to understand that you have already lost." The long-necked counselor's eyes widened, his throat tight with something between fear and realization. "We've failed," he whispered. "We've failed you, and we've failed the Empire." The silence that followed was heavier than any words could have been. Baba Yaga didn't need to say more. The reality was sinking in. They were defeated, not just by an outside force, but by their own hubris, by their inability to recognize that what they had destroyed could not be rebuilt. They had underestimated the one thing they thought they had already conquered, humanity's resilience. She looked at them all, her eyes piercing through their veneer of power, into the raw fear underneath. The empire they had built, a structure of pure control, had come crumbling down like a house of cards. "You thought," she began again, her voice softer now, almost gentle, "that you could erase what you did to me, to my son. You thought that by killing one boy, you would silence the rest of us. But you were wrong. You can't silence the truth. You can't erase what's already been set in motion." There was a pause, a long, drawn-out moment in which every counselor felt the full weight of her words. The room, once filled with voices, was now as silent as a graveyard. And within that silence, a different kind of understanding settled over them. The silver-scaled counselor, the one who had once been so sure of himself, now sank back in his chair, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "You're right," he said, his voice hollow. "We've been so sure of ourselves. So sure that we were invincible. And now, we're nothing." Baba Yaga nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering. "You're nothing because you never learned what true power was. You thought it was in your ships, your armies, your walls. You thought it was in your ability to destroy. But it was never about what you could destroy. It was always about what you could create." The council didn't respond. They couldn't. There was no grand gesture of surrender, no dramatic bow or proclamation. The words Baba Yaga had spoken had already cut deeper than any sword could. They had already been defeated by their own arrogance, their own blind certainty. Outside, the city of the Empire still hummed with life, unaware of the final moments that were unfolding within the walls of its heart. But within the chamber, the air felt thick with finality. The city was dying. The Empire was dying. And there was no escaping it. Baba Yaga's voice rang out again, firm and clear. Your future, what's left of it, depends on what you choose now. Submit to the will of humanity, acknowledge what you've done, and you will live. The Empire may live, but it will never be the same. The long-necked counselor looked at her, his gaze hollow. And if we resist? If we refuse? She stepped closer, her eyes sharp as glass. Then you will die quickly. Without fanfare. You will be forgotten, your name lost to history. You will become nothing but a cautionary tale. The last remnants of an empire that thought it could control everything, only to learn that it couldn't control what mattered most. Her words hung in the air like a death sentence. The honey badger let out a low growl, as though punctuating her statement, and the dog at her feet shifted slightly, its calm exterior unshaken, but its presence undeniable. The room felt smaller, the council more and more isolated in their failure. The silver-scaled counselor, once so certain of his power, now looked up, his eyes filled with something close to despair. We submit, he whispered, barely able to speak the words. We submit. But what does that mean? What will happen to us? Baba Yaga's expression softened, but it was not kindness that filled her gaze. It means you will learn to serve those you once oppressed. It means your world will change. It means humanity will no longer bow to you. The council had no response. They were broken, their arrogance shattered, their world irrevocably altered. Baba Yaga turned toward the door, her back to them as she began to walk away. The dog and the honey badger followed silently behind her. You've made your choice, she said over her shoulder, her voice soft but final. Now, live with it. And with that, she left the chamber, her footsteps echoing through the now silent halls. The doors shut behind her with a heavy finality, and with it, the fate of the empire was sealed. Outside, the capital city still buzzed, still unaware. But in the silence that followed Baba Yaga's departure, the empire knew one thing for certain: everything had changed. The storm was over. And they had lost. The silence that followed Baba Yaga's departure was not one of peace. It was a silence filled with dread, a stillness that seemed to stretch across the galaxy, binding it in a kind of suspended animation. The empire, once so confident, was now a fractured thing, its once indomitable walls crumbling from the inside out. The council, in their arrogance, had believed they were untouchable. But as the doors to the chamber closed behind Baba Yaga, they realized they had been mistaken. And now, nothing would ever be the same. Inside the council chamber, the remaining members sat in stunned silence. Their heads, once high and filled with unshakable pride, were now bowed, not in reverence, but in the weight of their own failure. The last echoes of Baba Yaga's footsteps had barely faded when the realization hit them fully. They had underestimated her. They had underestimated humanity. The silver-scaled counselor was the first to speak, though his voice sounded hollow, as if he were speaking through a veil. What now? He whispered, the words almost too soft to hear. What do we do? The long-necked counselor, his face pale and drawn, was the next to speak, his voice trembling with the kind of fear he had never allowed himself to feel before. We submit, he said, the word foreign in his mouth. There's nothing else left. We have no choice. The council's pride, once their greatest weapon, was now their greatest vulnerability. It had been shattered, not by a great battle or a force of arms, but by the quiet, unyielding presence of a single woman. A mother. And in her quiet rage, they had found their undoing. Outside the chamber, the empire's heart still beat. The capital city, once the pinnacle of imperial power, continued to hum with activity, unaware, at least for now, of the irreversible changes taking place in the shadows. But the people of the empire, from the highest officials to the lowest workers, could feel the change in the air. It wasn't immediate, but it was coming. The shift in power was palpable. It would take time for it to spread, but the knowledge of what had transpired in the council chamber would not remain contained. In the lower districts, in the factories and the streets, whispers began to circulate, whispers about the woman who had come to challenge the empire. Whispers of her wrath. And as the stories spread, they grew, morphing from simple accounts of a mother's revenge into something much greater. Baba Yaga was no longer just a mother, she had become a symbol. A symbol of defiance. Of power. Of something humanity had always had but had forgotten how to wield. The council's chambers were now a graveyard of their former arrogance. The once grand, gleaming seats of power were empty now, save for the last remnants of a dying regime. The members, broken and subdued, were left to grapple with their decisions, knowing that their empire, their reign, was no more. And yet, even in their defeat, they knew one thing to be true: the world they had known was gone. The empire, as they had built it, was no more. But the world would continue. Humanity would continue. The rebellion had already started, though they could not see it yet. In a small corner of the capital, a woman sat in the dim light of her home, her hands steady as she prepared a simple meal. Her dog lay by the hearth, its head resting against the stone floor, and a honey badger slept curled beside it. She could hear the distant hum of the city outside, a city that was not yet aware of the change that had begun. But she knew. She had known it from the moment she had received the message. The galaxy had been warned. Far from the bustling capital, in the deepest recesses of the Empire's vast network, systems began to fail. Communications cut out, and the once invincible shields began to flicker. The last remnants of Imperial command were scattered, their once proud fleets reduced to nothing more than debris floating in the void. Baba Yaga's fleet, small, quiet, and swift, had already moved to the next target. Not with weapons, not with force, but with the quiet certainty that the Empire had already been defeated. It was a slow, creeping thing, like the rise of dawn, but it was unstoppable. She had not come to destroy the Empire. The Empire had destroyed itself. In the distant corners of the galaxy, the news began to spread. Some believed it was just another myth, another tale spun by those who had nothing left to lose. But those who had lived through the rebellion, those who had felt the weight of the Empire's heel, knew better. They had seen what Baba Yaga had done. They had felt the shift in power, the change in the air. And they knew what was coming. The Empire had been built on the backs of those it had oppressed. But now, those very people, broken, beaten, and forgotten, were beginning to rise. It was not an army of soldiers or warships that would take down the Empire. It was the people themselves, empowered by the knowledge that their oppressors were no longer untouchable. And at the heart of it all stood one woman, Baba Yaga. The mother who had lost everything, but who had gained something far more powerful in return. The council had no time to mourn their failure. The world they had known was gone. The power they had relied on was fading. And with it, the future of the Empire was slipping away, piece by piece, until nothing remained but the rubble of a once mighty force. But even as the Empire crumbled, the universe shifted. The power had changed hands. And Baba Yaga, with her calm, unflinching presence, had shown them what true power was. In the quiet aftermath, with the city still buzzing unaware, Baba Yaga turned toward the stars once more. The work was not over. It had only just begun. And the Empire, for all its might, would never rise again.